Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I've never been one to believe in superstitions. Friday the 13th was just another day on the calendar to me, until 3 years ago when everything changed. It began with a simple text message from my friend Jared, suggesting a weekend camping trip to Snively Hot Springs in eastern Oregon. The date happened to fall on Friday the 13th, which several friends pointed out with theatrical warnings and jokes about horror movies. Anyone up for Snively this weekend? Jared's message read in our group chat, "Weather forecast looks perfect, and the hot springs will be amazing at night." I had a shift at the warehouse on Saturday morning, but the idea of escaping the city's confines for even one night was too tempting to resist. A quick mental calculation told me I could make it work if I limited my drinking and left early the next morning. "I'm in," I replied, "but I'll need to head back early Saturday for work." Within hours, our group had swelled to 11 people, myself, Jared, his girlfriend Maya, our mutual friends Wesley, Bennett, Isabella, Ruby, Kai, Zoe, Vincent, and Isabella's border collie, Scout. Most of us had known each other since college, bonded by our shared love for outdoor adventures. As we finalized plans throughout the week, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Perhaps it was Jared mentioning that the full moon would coincide with our trip, or the weather report warning of unusually cold temperatures for April, or simply the accumulation of small coincidences. My rational mind dismissed these thoughts as meaningless pattern-seeking, yet something felt off. The night before our departure, I packed with unusual care, extra layers, a high-powered flashlight, a fully charged power bank, and a comprehensive first aid kit. My roommate noticed my methodical preparation. "Planning for the apocalypse?" he joked, watching me organize my backpack. "Just being prepared," I replied. "We'll be pretty far from civilization." I didn't tell him about the strange dreams I'd been having all week. Dreams of being pursued through dark woods by something I couldn't see but could hear breathing behind me. Dreams where I ran until my lungs burned, but could never quite escape. We departed Portland just after noon on Friday, split between 3 vehicles. I rode with Jared, Maya, and Wesley in Jared's SUV, while the others followed in Bennett's truck and Vincent's compact car. The drive east took us through the Columbia River Gorge, where basalt cliffs towered over the highway and the river stretched blue and vast to our right. As we crossed into eastern Oregon, the landscape transformed dramatically. Lush forests gave way to high desert, a sparse, open terrain of sagebrush and juniper trees beneath an endless sky. The emptiness intensified as we turned onto progressively smaller roads, the pavement eventually yielding to gravel that crunched beneath our tires and sent dust billowing behind us. "How much farther?" Wesley asked from the back seat, where he'd been scrolling through his phone. "About 20 minutes, Jared replied, squinting at the setting sun. "We should get there just before dark if we don't hit any problems." The timing was perfect, or would have been, if not for the flat tire that forced us to stop 10 miles from our destination. While Jared and I worked to change it, Maya pointed out something concerning. "Look at those clouds moving in," she said, gesturing toward the western horizon where dark clouds had begun to gather. "That wasn't in the forecast." Wesley checked his weather app, frowning. "Still says clear all weekend." "Must be a localized system. The delay cost us the remaining daylight." By the time we arrived at Snively Hot Springs, darkness had fallen completely. The moon, nearly full but not quite, hung low in the eastern sky, casting enough light to outline the surrounding hills, but leaving the details in shadow. The other cars had arrived before us. Bennett had already started setting up the communal area where we'd be cooking and gathering around the fire. I could hear laughter and the sound of tent poles clicking together as we pulled in. "You guys made it," Isabella called, Scout barking excitedly beside her. We were starting to get worried. Flat tire, I explained, unloading my gear. Not the best start to a Friday the 13th camping trip. Don't even joke about that, Ruby said, her face illuminated by the beam of her headlamp. I'm already jumpy enough out here. We worked quickly to set up our tents in a rough semicircle around what would become our fire pit. The night air had grown unexpectedly cold, and the promise of warming ourselves by a fire spurred our efforts. In the distance, I could hear the soft bubbling of the hot springs, barely audible over the rustle of wind through the sagebrush. As I hammered the last stake into the hard ground, I paused, certain I'd heard something moving in the darkness beyond our campsite. I directed my headlamp toward the sound, but saw nothing except the swaying branches of a juniper tree. Probably just an animal, I told myself, though I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. With camp established, we gathered around the fire that Bennett and Kai had built. The flames pushed back the darkness, creating a circle of warmth and light that felt like a fortress against the vast, unseen wilderness beyond. Vincent unpacked a cooler filled with beer and handed them around. True to my plan, I accepted one, but resolved to stop there. Tomorrow's early shift loomed in my mind. To surviving Friday the 13th, Zoe joked, raising her can in a mock toast. And to hot springs under a full moon, Jared added. Actually, Maya corrected, full moon isn't until tomorrow night. Tonight it's just shy of full. Close enough, Wesley said, already opening his second beer. Either way, we've got perfect timing. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with this group. We discussed work, relationships, future plans, the usual topics among friends in their late 20s, navigating the complexities of adult life. As the night progressed, I noticed Kai and Wesley exchanging glances before Kai subtly passed something to Wesley beneath the firelight's glow. An hour later, Wesley approached me at the edge of our circle, where I'd moved to grab another layer from my tent. The temperature had dropped further, and my breath formed visible clouds in the air. Want to enhance the experience a bit? He asked quietly, showing me a small plastic bag containing what looked like dried mushroom pieces. Just a microdose, nothing too intense. Perfect for the hot springs later. I hesitated. Psychedelics weren't new to me, but I generally avoided them in unfamiliar settings. Still, the amount he offered was minimal, just enough to heighten perception without inducing hallucinations. Just a small amount, I agreed, accepting a tiny piece. I still need to drive tomorrow. Several others in our group had made the same choice, I soon realized. By the time we decided to visit the hot springs around 10 o'clock, a subtle shift in perception had begun. Colors from the fire seemed more vibrant, sounds slightly clearer, and the stars overhead impossibly bright against the black canvas of night. The hot springs were a short walk from our campsite, down a narrow trail that descended toward the river. Steam rose from the series of natural pools, creating ghostly shapes that danced in the moonlight. We changed into swimwear and slipped into the warm water, sighing collectively as the heat enveloped our bodies. This is perfect, Isabella murmured. Scout waiting patiently at the edge of the springs. I leaned back against the smooth rock edge, gazing up at the stars and the near full moon. The mild effects of the mushrooms enhanced the beauty of the moment. The contrast between the hot water and cold air, the distant hooting of an owl, the rippling patterns of moonlight on the water's surface. Yet even in this moment of tranquility, something felt wrong. Twice I caught myself scanning the darkness beyond our pools, certain I'd seen movement in the periphery of my vision. Scout seemed to sense it too. Occasionally rising to attention, ears perked forward, staring into the blackness before settling back down. After about an hour, Jared suggested something that would change everything. We should take advantage of this moonlight and go for a night walk, he said, his eyes bright with excitement. The view from the ridge above camp is incredible. Most of our friends declined, preferring to return to the warmth of the fire. But I found myself nodding along with Maya and Wesley, the subtle influence of the mushrooms, making the idea seem especially appealing. Scout would join us too, Isabella said, as the dog could use the exercise. None of us could have predicted what awaited us on that ridge. We dried off and changed back into our clothes, grabbing our flashlights before setting off. The microdose had reached its peak, not enough to distort reality, but sufficient to heighten my senses and create a heightened awareness of our surroundings. The night air felt electric against my skin as we began walking uphill from our camp, away from the safety of the fire and the others. Wesley led our small group, his powerful flashlight carving a tunnel of light through the darkness. Maya followed with Scout trotting alongside her, and I brought up the rear. Our breath formed clouds of vapor that caught the light of our beams before dissipating into the cold night. "The trail should be just ahead," Wesley said, directing his light toward a gap in the sagebrush. "It winds up to a viewpoint where you can see the whole valley." The path narrowed as we ascended, forcing us to walk single file. Juniper trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches reaching like arthritic fingers across our path. In the moonlight, every shadow seemed to move, and the subtle effects of the mushrooms didn't help. I found myself constantly turning to check behind us, unable to shake the feeling that we were being followed. "You okay back there?" Maya called over her shoulder, noticing my frequent glances behind us. "Yeah," I replied, not wanting to spread my unease. "Just taking in the surroundings." We had been walking for about 10 minutes when Scout suddenly froze, her body becoming rigid. Her ears flattened against her head, and a low growl rumbled in her throat. "What's wrong, girl?" Maya asked, kneeling beside the dog. Wesley directed his flashlight in the direction Scout was staring, but the beam revealed nothing except more juniper and sagebrush. The dog's behavior had unsettled all of us, though. We stood in silence, straining to hear whatever had alarmed her. That's when I heard it, a soft crunching sound like something moving carefully through the underbrush to our right. Scout's growl intensified. "Probably just a deer," Wesley suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. We continued walking, but the carefree mood had evaporated. Scout stayed close to Maya now, no longer ranging ahead to explore. The trail turned sharply to the right, leading us deeper into a section where the junipers grew thicker, blocking much of the moonlight. "The viewpoint should be just ahead," Wesley said. His voice hushed as if he feared being overheard. The sound came again, brush moving, but with a deliberate quality that seemed distinctly unlike a deer. This time it was closer, and immediately to our left. Wesley swung his flashlight toward the sound. 2 glowing eyes reflected the light, floating like eerie lanterns about 3 feet off the ground. "Don't move," Wesley whispered, his voice barely audible. The beam of his flashlight illuminated what we were facing, a full-grown mountain lion, its tawny coat blending perfectly with the surrounding landscape. It was massive, easily 150 pounds, with muscles rippling beneath its fur as it regarded us with predatory intensity. The distance between us couldn't have been more than 15 feet. My heart hammered against my ribcage with such force I was certain the others could hear it. The mild alteration to my perception from the mushrooms made the moment surreal. The mountain lion appeared simultaneously more detailed and more threatening, its whiskers, teeth, and the texture of its fur standing out with unnatural clarity. We began backing away slowly, remembering the conventional wisdom about large predators. Don't run, don't turn your back. Scout, displaying either remarkable training or terror-induced compliance, stayed perfectly still beside Maya, though a continuous low growl emanated from her throat. "Keep moving back," Wesley breathed, slow and steady. The mountain lion didn't advance, but its gaze remained fixed on us, tail twitching slightly. I'd never felt so exposed, so intensely aware of my vulnerability. Humans aren't designed to be prey, but in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity what it meant to be hunted. As we retreated, step by agonizing step, Scout suddenly bolted to our right, disappearing into the underbrush with a panicked yelp. The mountain lion's gaze flicked toward the movement, but to our surprise, it didn't give chase. Instead, those gleaming eyes returned to fix on us. "Scout!" Maya called in a harsh whisper, fear evident in her voice. "Don't," Wesley warned. "We can't split up." We continued our backward retreat until we reached a small clearing where the trail widened slightly. My back bumped against something solid, a fence marking the boundary of someone else's campsite. We'd backed up along the trail much farther than I'd realized. That's when we heard it, rapid movement through the underbrush behind us. Scout emerged from the darkness, racing toward us with her tail tucked between her legs. But the sound of movement didn't stop with her arrival. Something else was approaching from behind. Wesley swung his flashlight around, illuminating the source, a second mountain lion, smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. A juvenile, perhaps, but still easily capable of killing an adult human. "It's between us and camp," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. The realization struck us simultaneously. We were trapped between two predators, with only a fence at our backs. The situation had deteriorated from concerning to potentially fatal in seconds. Mountain lion attacks on humans are rare, but when they occur, they're often deadly. Now we faced two of them, cut off from the safety of our camp, with only a wire fence separating us from an unknown campsite behind us. "The fence," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "We need to get over it, now." Scout sensed our intent and squeezed through a gap at the bottom of the fence. The rest of us weren't so lucky. The fence stood about 5 feet high, topped with barbed wire, a standard cattle fence used throughout rural Oregon. Maya went first, Wesley boosting her up. Her jacket caught on the barbs, tearing audibly as she freed herself and dropped to the other side. As Wesley prepared to climb, the larger mountain lion took a step forward, muscles tensing in what looked like preparation to charge. My blood seemed to freeze in my veins. "Go!" I hissed at Wesley. "Now!" He scrambled up the fence with surprising agility, considering the circumstances. The barbed wire caught his pant leg, slicing through both fabric and skin. He grunted in pain, but pushed through, tumbling to the other side where Maya caught him before he could hit the ground. Now I was alone, facing two mountain lions, with only a failing flashlight between us. The battery was dying, the beam growing noticeably dimmer. I backed against the fence, feeling the cold metal press against my back. "Come on," Maya urged from the other side. I gripped the wire, feeling it bite into my palms as I pulled myself up. The smaller mountain lion darted forward suddenly, covering half the distance between us in a single bound. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I hauled myself upward, ignoring the barbs that tore at my clothing and skin. As I swung my leg over the top, I felt a sharp pain across my calf, barbed wire cutting through my jeans and into flesh. I didn't stop, dropping to the other side and landing hard on my shoulder. Wesley and Maya pulled me to my feet immediately, and we stumbled backward, putting distance between ourselves and the fence. Looking back, I saw both mountain lions pacing on the other side, their eyes still reflecting what little light remained from our flashlights. They made no attempt to follow us over the fence, a small mercy in an otherwise nightmarish situation. We had escaped immediate danger, but our problems were far from over. We found ourselves in a stranger's campsite, bleeding from multiple cuts, with no clear path back to our own camp except through mountain lion territory. "Where are we?" Maya whispered, scanning our surroundings. The campsite appeared deserted. A large tent stood about 20 yards away, and beside it, a parked SUV. A cold fire pit suggested the occupants had either gone to sleep or were away from their camp. "Hello," Wesley called out, his voice carefully modulated to be loud enough to alert anyone nearby without carrying back to the mountain lions. "Is anyone here?"
"We need help!"
No response came from the tent or anywhere else in the campsite. The silence felt wrong somehow, oppressive and unnatural. Even the usual night sounds, insects, wind in the trees, seemed to have ceased. "Let's try the car," I suggested. "If we can sound the horn, it might scare off the mountain lions and alert our friends." We approached the SUV cautiously, Scout staying close to Maya's heels. The vehicle was unlocked, not unusual in such a remote location where crime was virtually non-existent. Wesley slid into the driver's seat and located the horn, pressing it in a series of long blasts that shattered the night's silence. "We're not thieves!" Maya shouted between horn blasts. "There are mountain lions nearby. We're just trying to get back to our camp." We waited, expecting the occupants of the tent to emerge, likely angry at being awakened but present nonetheless. The tent remained still and silent. "Something's wrong," I said, voicing what we all felt. "Someone should have come out by now." Maya's face had gone pale in the moonlight. "I think I heard something," she whispered, "from inside the tent, like someone trying to scream, but they can't." Wesley and I exchanged glances, neither wanting to acknowledge the implication of Maya's words. Scout whined softly, pressing against Maya's leg. "We need to check," Wesley finally said. "If someone's hurt in there, or we need to find another way back to camp," I countered, the logical part of my brain fighting against the creeping dread. "Our friends will be wondering where we are." Maya shook her head. "If someone's in trouble, we can't just leave." The decision made, we approached the tent with extreme caution. Wesley called out again as we drew closer. "Hello? We're coming closer to check if you're okay. Please respond if you can hear us." Still no answer. The tent was large, an 8-person model with a canopy extension at the front. The entrance flap was zipped shut. Wesley reached for the zipper, then hesitated, turning to us. "I don't know if we should..." A sound from inside the tent made the decision for us, a distinct thump, like something heavy falling over. Wesley unzipped the entrance in one quick motion and directed his flashlight inside. The beam revealed an empty interior, sleeping bags neatly arranged, personal items organized along the tent walls, but no people. A camp lantern lay on its side, apparently the source of the noise we'd heard. "There's no one here," Maya said, confusion evident in her voice. I stepped closer, examining the scene more carefully. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a coffee mug beside one of the sleeping bags. I touched the side gently. "Still warm?" Wesley moved his light around the tent's interior, revealing more disturbing details. A book lay open, face down as if hastily discarded. A pair of hiking boots stood ready beside the entrance. A cell phone sat on top of a folded sweatshirt. "They left in a hurry," Wesley observed, his voice tight. "Nobody leaves their phone behind voluntarily." "Or their shoes," Maya added, pointing to the hiking boots. The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Something had happened to the occupants of this tent, something that had forced them to leave suddenly without taking essential items. The mountain lions? Perhaps, but why wouldn't they have taken shelter in their vehicle? "We need to get out of here," I said, backing away from the tent. Now, no one argued. We exited the tent, zipping it closed behind us, as if that small gesture of normalcy could somehow counterbalance the wrongness of what we'd found. The mountain lions were no longer visible at the fence line, which presented both relief and a new concern. Where had they gone? "Let's find the road," Wesley suggested. "It has to connect to the main access road eventually." We located a dirt track leading away from the campsite in the opposite direction from where we'd entered. Scout took the lead, seemingly eager to put distance between us and the abandoned tent. Each of us was lost in thought, processing what we'd seen and what it might mean. After walking for about 5 minutes, the dirt track widened and joined a more established gravel road. Looking around, I realized we were approaching Snively Hot Springs from the opposite direction. "I know where we are," I said with relief. "Our camp is about half a mile that way." We quickened our pace, drawing comfort from the familiar route and the knowledge that our friends were nearby. As we rounded the final bend, the glow of our campfire came into view, along with the welcome sound of voices and laughter. Bennett was the first to spot us.
"There they are!"
he called out. We were about to send out a search party. Our friends gathered around as we stumbled into camp, noting our torn clothing and the blood on Wesley's leg. "What happened to you guys?" Isabella asked, rushing forward to greet Scout, who seemed remarkably composed, given what we'd experienced. Wesley, Maya, and I exchanged glances, silently debating how much to share. The story sounded bizarre, even to us who had lived through it. Would our friends think the mushrooms had caused us to hallucinate or exaggerate the danger?
Mountain lions, I finally said.
2 of them. They trapped us on the trail. The expressions of disbelief quickly turned to concern as we recounted our experience, including the abandoned campsite. Zoe, who had wilderness first aid training, immediately set about cleaning and bandaging Wesley's leg wound and the various cuts we'd all sustained from the barbed wire. "We should report this to the ranger station in the morning," Vincent said when we'd finished our account. Both the mountain lions and the abandoned camp. I nodded in agreement, but found myself unable to shake the feeling that we'd encountered something beyond a natural hazard tonight, something I couldn't quite articulate. While the others continued to enjoy themselves around the campfire, I retreated to my car, ostensibly to change into dry clothes. In reality, I needed space to process what had happened. Inside the vehicle with the doors locked, I finally allowed the full weight of the night's events to crash over me. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. My breathing came in short, painful gasps that couldn't seem to fill my lungs. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold night air. I recognized the symptoms of a panic attack. I'd had them before, but never with this intensity. The car's interior seemed to shrink around me, and I rolled down the window to gulp the fresh air. Tiny gnats, attracted by the dome light, immediately swarmed through the opening, adding a maddening sensation of insects crawling across my skin. I swatted at them frantically, irrationally, my mind connecting them to the creeping dread that had pursued us through the darkness. For nearly an hour I sat there, alternating between moments of relative calm and surges of paralyzing terror. Through the windshield, I could see my friends laughing, drinking, seemingly unfazed by the story we'd shared. Even Wesley and Maya had rejoined the group, though I noticed they stayed closer to the fire than before, and Maya kept Scout by her side. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and I reclined the seat, intending to rest briefly before rejoining the others. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, morning light was filtering through the windows, and someone was tapping on the glass. "Hey, you alive in there?" It was Jared, concern evident in his expression. I rolled down the window, wincing at the stiffness in my neck from sleeping in the car. "Yeah, just needed some space last night." "We're packing up," he said. "Thought you wanted to get an early start back for work?" Work. The thought seemed absurd after what had happened, but I nodded mechanically. "Right. Give me a few minutes." As our group broke camp, a ranger's vehicle pulled into the area. Vincent had made good on his promise to report our encounter, using someone's satellite phone to call the ranger station at first light. The ranger, a weathered woman in her 50s named Officer Mendez, listened to our account with professional interest. "Mountain lion sightings aren't uncommon in this area," she confirmed, making notes in a small book. "But 2 together, that's unusual. Probably a mother and nearly grown cub." When we mentioned the abandoned campsite, her expression changed subtly. "Can you show me where this was?" Wesley, his leg properly bandaged now, offered to lead her to the site. They departed as the rest of us finished loading our vehicles. I should have felt relief as we prepared to return to civilization, but something nagged at me, a sense of unfinished business, of questions unanswered. Before leaving, I approached Maya, who was securing Scout in Bennett's truck. "Do you think those people are okay?" I asked quietly. "From the tent?" Maya's eyes met mine, and I saw in them the same uncertainty I felt. "I don't know," she admitted. "I keep thinking about that warm coffee mug. Whatever happened, it happened quickly." We embraced briefly, sharing an unspoken understanding of how the night had changed us. Some experiences create bonds that don't require explanation. I drove back to Portland alone, having decided to leave early as planned, despite the absurdity of worrying about my job after facing death. The highway stretched before me, sunlight making the events of the previous night seem distant and dreamlike. But whenever I closed my eyes, even to blink, I saw those glowing predator eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Upon reaching the city, I called my supervisor to explain my absence, fabricating a story about car trouble. It didn't matter. I was informed that my position had been filled that morning, company policy, for no shows. Under normal circumstances, I would have been devastated. Instead, I felt only numbness, followed by a strange sense of liberation. In the days that followed, I learned from Jared that Officer Mendez had found the abandoned campsite exactly as we'd described it. The registered campers, a couple from Washington State, were reported missing when they failed to return from their trip. Their vehicle remained at the site, their personal belongings undisturbed inside their tent. No trace of the couple has ever been found. The official report suggested they may have encountered the same mountain lions we did, with a less fortunate outcome. But this explanation never satisfied me. The lack of signs of struggle, the warm coffee, the missing shoes, these details haunted my thoughts. I never went camping again after that night. The trauma manifested in unexpected ways, a fear of darkness that had never troubled me before, an inability to sleep without a light on, panic attacks triggered by sounds similar to those we'd heard in the wilderness. I sought therapy, which helped manage the symptoms, but couldn't erase the fundamental way that night had altered my perception of safety in the world. 3 years have passed, but every full moon still fills me with inexplicable dread. I've refused all invitations that might take me back to remote areas, especially at night. My friends have largely stopped asking, accepting without fully understanding that something in me broke that night at Snively Hot Springs. Sometimes I wonder if it was really just mountain lions we encountered in the darkness. The rational part of my mind insists it was. Dangerous predators, but natural ones, operating according to their instincts in their native habitat. Yet in my dreams, I still see those eyes reflecting our flashlight beams, and they seem to contain something more than animal hunger, an intelligence, a purpose that defies explanation. Whatever stalked us under that nearly full moon on Friday the 13th took more than just my job and peace of mind. It took my certainty about the world and my place in it. Some dangers can be escaped physically while continuing to pursue us in ways we never anticipated, through the darkest corners of our minds where reason fails and primal fear reigns eternal. But I've spent most of my adult life trying to understand the story my mother told me. Growing up, I knew she harbored something, a memory or experience that occasionally surfaced in her cautious glances toward the tree line when dusk approached. It wasn't until 2018, when I was helping her pack for her move to a retirement community, that she finally shared what happened in the summer of 1979. What follows is her account as told to me, reconstructed with the details I've carefully collected over numerous conversations since then. My mother, Diane, grew up in the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee, where the Appalachian wilderness still held secrets in its ancient hollows and densely wooded slopes. Her childhood home was a sturdy log cabin situated on 40 acres of woodland property, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable after heavy rains. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down the mountain, and the closest town was a 40-minute drive when road conditions were favorable. Diane's father, my grandfather James, worked as a wholesale buyer at car auctions across several states. His job required frequent travel, sometimes leaving him away from home for 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch. My grandmother Eleanor managed the property while working 4 shifts weekly at the Pinewood Diner, a local establishment that served hearty meals to locals and the occasional lost tourist. This arrangement left my mother and her younger sister Rebecca largely to their own devices, especially during summer breaks when school couldn't provide structure to their days. In that era, children enjoyed freedoms nearly unimaginable today. While children in suburbs played within the confines of fenced yards and paved driveways, my mother roamed miles of untamed forest, returning home only when hunger or darkness demanded it. The mountains were my playground, she often told me, a nostalgic smile briefly lifting the perpetual furrow between her brows. I knew every stream, every rock formation within 5 miles of our house. I could identify tracks from deer, raccoon, possum, and fox. I knew which berries were safe to eat and which mushrooms to avoid. Her father had crafted her a simple wooden slingshot when she turned 7, and it became her constant companion. She practiced relentlessly until she could hit a tin can from 20 paces with remarkable consistency. But this wasn't merely play. In the remote mountains, self-reliance wasn't optional. It was necessary. She learned to start fires, identify north without a compass, and find her way home from any point in the surrounding forest. Looking back now, I understand that these skills served her well on that July afternoon in 1979, the day the forest betrayed her. Diane's early years followed the natural rhythms of the mountains. Spring meant watching for the first trillium flowers to emerge from the forest floor and listening for the return of migrating birds. Summer brought wild blackberries that stained her fingers purple, and swimming in the cold, clear streams that cut through the property. Fall transformed the mountains into a riot of color before winter stripped the trees bare and sometimes isolated the family completely when heavy snow made the dirt road impassable. My mother developed a deep connection to those woods. She knew when the first ramps would appear in spring and where the best fishing spots were along Henderson Creek that bisected their property. She tracked the seasonal movements of deer herds and recognized individual birds by their distinctive markings or behaviors. The forest was not merely a backdrop to her childhood, it was an intimate companion. Grandfather James, though frequently absent, gave Diane practical education during his time at home. He taught her to read weather patterns, to build simple shelters, and to respect the wilderness without fearing it. The forest doesn't hate you or love you, he would say. It simply exists. Understand it, and you'll never be truly lost. Grandmother Eleanor contributed her own form of knowledge, sharing Appalachian folk traditions that blended practical wisdom with cautionary tales. She taught Diane which plants had medicinal properties, how wild ginger could settle an upset stomach, how witch hazel could reduce swelling from insect bites. She also warned about the mountain's dangers, both natural and, occasionally, supernatural. Most of Grandma's stories were practical. My mother explained when I pressed her about these warnings. Don't wander too far, because you might encounter a bear or fall into a ravine. But sometimes, especially on stormy nights when the wind howled through the pine trees, she'd mention other things that might be lurking in the deep woods. When I asked what things she meant, my mother would typically change the subject. I now understand why. Rebecca, 4 years younger than Diane, was her constant shadow during these formative years. Where Diane was bold and adventurous, Rebecca was cautious and observant. Together they formed a complementary pair, Diane leading them into new territories, while Rebecca often noticed details her older sister missed in her enthusiasm. They built elaborate forts from fallen branches, created imaginary kingdoms in rocky outcroppings, and spent endless hours wading in the cool streams that laced through the property. Their childhood wasn't without modern comforts. The cabin had electricity, running water, and a telephone for emergencies. But television reception was poor at best, and the isolation meant entertainment largely came from books, imagination, and the natural world around them. My mother recalls these years with genuine fondness, describing a childhood that seemed to exist outside of time, connected to traditions and patterns of life that stretched back generations. I never felt deprived, she insisted. I felt privileged. My friends who lived in town seemed trapped to me, confined to streets and yards, while I had an entire mountain range to explore. This freedom formed the core of her identity, until the day it became the source of her most profound terror. July 17, 1979, began like countless summer days before it. The morning air hung heavy with humidity, promising afternoon thunderstorms that would temporarily cool the mountain before leaving everything draped in steam. James had been away for 9 days on a buying trip that took him through Kentucky and into Ohio. Eleanor had the breakfast shift at the diner, which meant she'd left before dawn, leaving Diane to watch over Rebecca. The previous day, Rebecca had badly twisted her ankle while attempting to follow Diane up a particularly steep trail. The swelling hadn't subsided overnight, and by morning, Rebecca couldn't put weight on it without wincing in pain. Eleanor decided to take her to Dr. Marshall in town after finishing her shift, leaving Diane alone for the afternoon. "Be careful," Eleanor cautioned, before helping Rebecca into their weathered blue Chevrolet. "Storms coming later. Don't go beyond Henderson Creek, and be back before dark." Standard instructions that Diane acknowledged with the casual confidence of a 9-year-old who considered herself practically grown. As the car disappeared down the dirt road, Diane felt the familiar thrill of complete freedom. She pulled her hair into a ponytail, filled a canteen with water, grabbed her slingshot and a cloth bag for collecting interesting rocks or other treasures, and set out toward the western section of the property. This area contained some of the oldest growth forest on their land, massive tulip poplars and white oaks that had stood for centuries, their broad canopies creating cathedral-like spaces beneath. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the leaves, illuminating patches of forest floor in golden spotlights that shifted with the breeze. The rich, earthy scent of decomposing vegetation mingled with the sharp sweetness of pine resin and wildflowers. Diane moved with the unconscious grace of someone intimately familiar with their environment. She stepped over exposed roots without looking down, ducked under low-hanging branches automatically, and navigated around poison ivy patches without breaking stride. Occasionally, she paused to shoot a small rock at a tree trunk, testing her aim and enjoying the solid thwack when she hit her target. She spent the morning exploring, eventually finding herself on a ridge overlooking a section of Henderson Creek she rarely visited. The creek widened here, creating a small pool before continuing its journey downslope. The water looked invitingly cool and clear. Diane decided this would be the perfect spot to spend the hottest part of the day. Making her way down to the creek took longer than expected. The slope was steeper than it appeared from above, forcing her to zigzag carefully between trees and use saplings as handholds to prevent sliding. By the time she reached the creek bank, sweat had soaked through her t-shirt, and her stomach growled with hunger. She sat on a smooth rock beside the water, unpacking the sandwich she'd brought, peanut butter with her grandmother's homemade blackberry jam. As she ate, she noticed how the usual forest sounds seemed particularly vibrant here. Birds called to each other overhead. Insects buzzed among wildflowers growing along the bank, and the creek itself provided a constant, soothing background of gentle splashing and gurgling. After lunch, Diane removed her sneakers and waded into the shallow edges of the pool. The water felt shockingly cold against her sun-warmed skin, but she quickly adjusted, delighting in the smooth stones beneath her feet and the tiny minnows that darted away from her shadow. Time slipped away as she explored the creek, finding crayfish hiding under rocks and collecting unusually shaped pebbles for her collection. The position of the sun warned her that afternoon was advancing, but she wasn't concerned. She knew her mother and Rebecca wouldn't return from town for hours yet, and despite the gathering clouds, the threatened storms hadn't materialized. She decided to refill her pebble supply for the slingshot before heading home. The creek bed offered perfect ammunition, smooth, round stones that fit comfortably in the leather pouch of her slingshot. As she knelt by the water's edge, selecting the best stones and placing them in her pocket, she failed to notice how the forest sounds had begun to change. Later, she would recognize this moment as the dividing line in her life, before and after. But in that instant, she was simply a 9-year-old girl enjoying a perfect summer day, unaware that something was watching her from the opposite bank. The change in the forest atmosphere came gradually, then suddenly, like falling asleep. One moment, Diane was absorbed in selecting stones from the creek bed. The next, she became aware of an unsettling silence that had crept over her surroundings. The birds had stopped their calling. The insects no longer buzzed. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. My mother described this moment with remarkable clarity, even decades later. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The forest never goes completely silent. There's always something making noise, but suddenly nothing. Like someone had pressed a mute button on the whole world. She straightened up slowly, her hand instinctively tightening around her slingshot. The hairs on her arms stood up despite the humid air. She scanned the surrounding trees, expecting to see a black bear or perhaps a coyote, natural predators whose presence might explain the forest's sudden silence. What she saw instead defied her understanding of the natural world. Across the creek, partially obscured by a thicket of rhododendron, stood a figure. At first glance, her mind tried to categorize it as human, perhaps a hunter or hiker who had strayed onto their property. But as her eyes adjusted and her brain processed what she was seeing, she realized this was something else entirely. The figure was massive, far larger than any man she had ever seen. It appeared to be kneeling or crouching at the creek's edge, partially hidden by vegetation. Dark hair covered its body, not clothing, but actual hair, thick and matted in places. The coloration wasn't uniform black, but varied from dark brown to reddish tints where sunlight hit it through the canopy. Diane froze, unable to move as her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. The creature remained motionless as well, and for several heartbeats they existed in a terrible tableau of mutual observation. Then it moved. A massive arm reached out to brace against a nearby tree trunk. The movement was deliberate, almost careful. Diane could see muscles shifting beneath the hair, powerful muscles that spoke of immense strength. The hand that gripped the tree had opposable thumbs, she would later recall, but the fingers were thicker. The nails darker and more claw-like than human nails. She wanted to run, but remained rooted in place, her body refusing to obey her mind's increasingly frantic commands. The creature tilted its head slightly, and she caught a glimpse of its face, a face that haunted her nightmares for years afterward. It wasn't a human face, but it wasn't an animal's either, she told me, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper, even in the safety of her living room, decades later. The eyes were what got me. They were deep-set under a heavy brow, dark but intelligent. They weren't animal eyes. There was something looking at me from behind those eyes, something that was thinking. The creature's gaze locked with hers across the creek, and in that moment, Diane felt utterly exposed, as if those eyes could see through her, could read her thoughts and know her fears. An involuntary whimper escaped her throat. The sound seemed to trigger something. The creature's chest expanded as it drew in a breath, and then it vocalized, a sound my mother struggled to describe even years later. It wasn't a growl or a roar like a bear. It was purposeful. It started low, almost like a human trying to clear their throat, but then it built into something that vibrated through the air. I felt it more than heard it, like standing next to a speaker at a concert. It pressed against my chest and made my ears hurt. The vocalization echoed through the small valley, bouncing off the surrounding ridges before fading. In the silence that followed, Diane realized she had fallen to her knees, her hands pressed against her ears. When she looked up, the creature was standing. What had seemed large before now became truly massive. It unfolded from its crouching position to stand upright on two legs. My mother estimated it stood at least 9 feet tall, possibly taller. Its broad shoulders and barrel chest giving it an imposing silhouette against the forest backdrop. "That's when I finally found the ability to move," she said. Something in my brain just snapped, and suddenly I was running. She bolted away from the creek, scrambling up the steep bank she had so carefully navigated earlier. Roots tore at her hands as she pulled herself upward. Branches whipped across her face, but she barely noticed. Behind her, she heard a second vocalization, louder than the first, with a different cadence that somehow conveyed anger or challenge. Diane ran blindly, her only thought to put distance between herself and the creature. She abandoned the trails, crashing through underbrush and thickets, ignoring the scratches and cuts that accumulated on her exposed arms and legs. Twice she fell, the second time tumbling down a short incline and striking her head against a fallen log. Stars burst in her vision, but terror drove her back to her feet. How long she ran, she couldn't later say. Time distorted in her panic. The gathering storm clouds had darkened the forest, making it difficult to maintain her bearings. At some point, she realized she had become disoriented, no longer certain of the direction toward home. She forced herself to stop, pressing her back against a large oak tree as she gasped for breath. Blood trickled from numerous scratches on her legs, and her clothing was torn in several places. She strained to listen for any sound of pursuit, but heard nothing beyond her own pounding heartbeat and ragged breathing. As the initial surge of adrenaline began to fade, reason slowly reasserted itself. She needed to find her way home. Looking up, she sought gaps in the canopy that might reveal the position of the sun, an orientation technique her father had taught her. Through one such gap, she spotted darker clouds gathering. A storm was approaching. Using the cloud's movement to determine direction, she oriented herself and began moving with more purpose, still hurrying but no longer in blind panic. Every few steps, she paused to listen, terrified of hearing heavy footsteps following her trail. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the first drops of rain began to filter through the canopy. The cooling moisture felt like a blessing on her overheated skin, helping to clear her mind further. The rain also obscured sounds, however, making it impossible to know if she was being followed. After what seemed like hours, but was likely less than 45 minutes, Diane caught sight of a familiar lightning-struck pine that marked one of the boundaries of their regular exploration area. Relief flooded through her as she realized she was less than half a mile from home. The rain had intensified, turning the forest floor slippery and treacherous. Twice more she fell, the second time sliding several feet down a muddy incline. By the time she staggered into the clearing surrounding their cabin, she was soaked to the skin, covered in mud. Her legs streaked with blood from numerous scratches and cuts. The blue Chevrolet wasn't in the driveway. Her mother and sister hadn't yet returned from town. Diane stumbled up the porch steps and collapsed against the front door, fumbling with trembling hands to retrieve the key from its hiding place beneath the flower pot. Once inside, she slammed the door shut and engaged every lock, then systematically moved through the house, closing and locking all the windows, despite the summer heat. Only then, secure within familiar walls, did the full emotional impact of what she had experienced crash over her. When Eleanor and Rebecca returned from town 2 hours later, they found Diane huddled in a corner of the living room, a kitchen knife clutched in her hand, her eyes fixed on the windows. Her clothes were torn and muddy, her legs covered in dried blood from numerous scratches, her hair tangled with leaves and twigs. "What happened to you?" Eleanor gasped, rushing to her daughter's side. Diane opened her mouth to explain, but found herself unable to articulate what she had seen. How could she describe something that defied categorization? The words that finally emerged were simply, "I fell from a tree." Eleanor clearly didn't believe this explanation. But after checking Diane for serious injuries and finding none beyond superficial scratches and bruises, she didn't press the issue. She helped Diane into a warm bath, gently washed the mud and blood away, applied antiseptic to the worst scratches, and prepared her favorite dinner, grilled cheese sandwiches with tomato soup. That night, as thunder rumbled outside and rain pattered against the roof, Diane lay awake in the bedroom she shared with Rebecca, listening intently for any sound that might indicate the creature had followed her home. Every creak of the cabin's wooden structure, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through her system. Rebecca, her ankle propped on a pillow, watched her sister with concern. "What really happened today?" she whispered after their mother had gone to bed. Diane considered telling her sister the truth, but feared Rebecca wouldn't believe her, or worse, would believe her and be frightened. "I got lost in the storm," she said finally. "I panicked and ran through some brambles. Rebecca studied her face in the dim light filtering through their curtains. "You're different," she said simply, a statement rather than a question. Diane couldn't argue with this assessment. She felt different, as if the foundations of her world had shifted. The forest that had always been her sanctuary now seemed filled with threat and uncertainty. Sleep finally claimed her near dawn, bringing dreams of dark eyes watching her from the trees. The following days established a pattern that would persist for the remainder of that summer. Diane refused to venture into the woods alone, insisting that Rebecca accompany her even on short excursions to the garden at the edge of the clearing. She startled at unexpected sounds and developed a habit of constantly scanning the tree line. Her slingshot, once a toy, became a talisman she carried everywhere, though she understood its inadequacy against what she had encountered. When James returned from his buying trip, he immediately noticed the change in his daughter. Where once she had begged him for stories of his travels, she now seemed distracted and anxious. When he suggested they go fishing at Henderson Creek, she invented excuses to avoid it. "Did something happen while I was gone?" he asked Eleanor one evening, his voice low to prevent the girls from overhearing. "Something spooked her in the woods," Eleanor replied, glancing toward the living room where Diane sat reading, her back deliberately turned toward the windows. "She says she fell from a tree, but—" She left the sentence unfinished. James tried to draw Diane out during a walk around the perimeter of their clearing, carefully staying within sight of the cabin at her insistence. "These mountains hold secrets," he said, "but most of them aren't dangerous if you understand them." Diane considered telling him then. He would believe her, wouldn't he? He knew these mountains better than anyone. But the words caught in her throat. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was making up stories for attention? Worse, what if he did believe her and decided to hunt for the creature? The thought of her father confronting those intelligent eyes filled her with dread. "I'm just being silly," she said finally. "I got scared in a thunderstorm." James studied her face, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to push further. "Well, the woods will be waiting when you're ready to return to them." But Diane wasn't sure she would ever be ready. As July gave way to August, she developed elaborate systems to avoid being alone outdoors. She volunteered to help Eleanor with indoor chores she had previously avoided. She developed a sudden interest in cooking and sewing, activities that kept her safely within walls. When Rebecca's ankle healed and she wanted to resume their explorations, Diane steered them toward the front of the property, away from Henderson Creek and the western woods. At night, she insisted on leaving a light burning in their bedroom, much to Rebecca's annoyance. She positioned her bed to face the window, unable to sleep if her back was turned to it. Often she woke, gasping from nightmares she couldn't or wouldn't describe to her increasingly concerned family. By summer's end, Diane had constructed a new normal for herself, one built around vigilance and restricted movement. When school resumed in September, she felt a profound relief at having structured days spent in the brick building in town. Surrounded by other children and adults, safely removed from the forest and its secrets, the creature never returned to their property, at least not that anyone observed. But its singular appearance had permanently altered Diane's relationship with the natural world and, in many ways, with herself. As months stretched into years, Diane maintained her silence about what she had seen that July afternoon. The incident became encapsulated within her, a secret core around which she constructed her adolescent and adult identity. Outwardly, she appeared to recover from whatever had frightened her in the woods. She participated in school activities, made friends, even occasionally joined family hiking trips, though she always insisted they stay on marked trails and travel in groups. Inwardly, however, the encounter remained vivid, undiminished by time. Certain triggers could instantly transport her back to that moment by the creek, the particular quality of silence before a summer storm, the smell of wet earth and vegetation, the sound of running water over stones. When these sensory cues aligned, she would find herself frozen, heart racing, as the memory surfaced with visceral immediacy. By her teenage years, Diane had researched enough to put a name to what she believed she had encountered: Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or one of the many regional variations of the legend. She secretly consumed books and articles on cryptozoology, comparing reported sightings with her own experience. Noting the similarities and differences, some accounts seemed credible and aligned closely with what she had witnessed. Others struck her as obvious fabrications or misidentifications. She developed a critical eye for these distinctions, becoming an unacknowledged expert on a subject she never discussed. Her silence stemmed from multiple sources. Fear of ridicule was certainly one factor. By the mid-1980s, Bigfoot had become a cultural punchline, featured in sensationalist tabloids, alongside stories of Elvis sightings and alien abductions. Diane, now a serious student with college aspirations, couldn't risk her reputation by associating herself with such fringe beliefs. More profound was her sense that the experience was somehow private, a moment of contact with something ancient and separate from ordinary human experience. Sharing it would inevitably diminish it, reducing something profound to mere anecdote. There was also an element of protection in her silence. As long as she told no one, she didn't have to defend the reality of what she had seen. The memory remained pure, uncontaminated by others' interpretations or explanations. When she left for college in 1988, Diane made a conscious decision to reinvent herself. She would no longer be the strange, watchful girl who startled at unexpected sounds and avoided walking alone at dusk. At the University of Tennessee, she cultivated a persona of academic dedication with a side interest in geology, a scientifically respectable way to collect and classify the interesting rocks and minerals that had fascinated her since childhood. She rarely returned to the family cabin, citing academic commitments even during breaks. When she did visit, she noticed how the property had changed. James had cleared additional land for a larger garden. The forest had receded slightly from their boundaries, and development had begun to encroach on the once isolated area as vacation homes appeared on neighboring ridges. These changes brought a mixture of relief and sadness. The wilderness that had both nurtured and terrified her was slowly being domesticated, made safe for weekend visitors who would never know its deeper secrets. In her junior year of college, Diane met Michael, my father, in an environmental science elective. Their shared interest in natural systems drew them together, though Diane was careful to focus their outdoor activities on coastal areas and plains, rather than densely forested mountains. When they married in 1993, she suggested they settle in eastern North Carolina, where Michael had been offered a position with a conservation organization. The landscape there, flat, agricultural, with forests of pine plantations rather than ancient mixed hardwoods, felt controllable in a way the Tennessee mountains never had. I was born the following year, followed by my brother 2 years later. As we grew, Diane proved to be a cautiously encouraging mother, balancing safety concerns with opportunities for exploration. She taught us to identify plants and animals, to read weather patterns, to navigate using natural landmarks, all skills her father had taught her. But unlike her childhood experience, our explorations were always supervised, always bounded by clear limits and safety protocols. The world is full of wonders, she would tell us, but some wonders deserve respectful distance. At the time, I interpreted this as standard parental caution. Only later would I understand the depths from which this philosophy emerged. For nearly 40 years, my mother kept her experience secret. She never spoke of it to her parents, her sister, my father, or to me and my brother. The encounter remained sealed within her, influencing her choices and perspectives in ways we couldn't recognize because we lacked the context to understand them. What finally broke this decades-long silence was, ironically, my casual mention of a hiking trip I planned to take with friends in the Appalachian Mountains, not far from her childhood home. I was visiting her in April 2018, helping sort through belongings as she prepared to downsize from the family home to a retirement community following my father's death the previous year. We were in the attic, opening boxes that hadn't been touched in years when I mentioned the upcoming trip. I expected no particular reaction, perhaps some practical advice about weather conditions or trail recommendations. Instead, my mother went very still, her hands freezing in the act of sorting through old photographs. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice so changed that I looked up in alarm. "Something I should have told you years ago." We moved to the kitchen, where she made tea with deliberate, measured movements that I recognized as her way of composing herself. Then, sitting across from me at the table, where our family had shared thousands of meals, she began to speak. The story emerged haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as decades of silence gave way to release. She recounted the events of that July day in 1979 with astonishing detail. The quality of light filtering through the trees, the temperature of the creek water, the precise sound of the creature's vocalization, the intelligence in its eyes. I listened without interruption, recognizing the profound significance of this moment. It was the missing piece that explained so many of my mother's peculiarities. Her insistence on our always hiking in groups, her subtle tension when visiting densely wooded areas, her preference for homes with minimal surrounding forest. When she finished, silence filled the kitchen. Outside, spring rain tapped against the windows, creating a gentle backdrop to the momentous revelation that hung in the air between us. "You believe me, don't you?" she finally asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. In that moment she looked younger somehow, as if sharing the story had temporarily transported her back to that 9-year-old girl by the creek. Did I believe her? The rational part of my mind catalogued alternative explanations. A bear standing on hind legs, an unusually tall human with a beard, a child's imagination transforming an ordinary encounter into something extraordinary. Yet I couldn't dismiss the consistency and clarity of her account, nor the evident sincerity with which she shared it. "I believe you experienced something profound," I said carefully. "Something that defied your understanding of the world." She studied my face, clearly assessing whether my response represented belief or diplomatic evasion. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her. "I've never told anyone before," she said. "Not even your father." "Why now?" I asked. "Because you're going to those mountains," she replied. "And while I don't think you'll encounter what I encountered, I need you to understand why certain precautions matter." She proceeded to give me practical advice. Never hike alone. Avoid creek beds during the quietest part of the afternoon. Trust the sudden silence of the forest as a warning sign. Always have multiple routes of retreat planned. Advice that would have seemed paranoid without the context she had just provided. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you," she emphasized. "The mountains aren't malevolent. They're just more complex than most people realize." In the days that followed, we revisited the story multiple times. Each conversation revealed additional details she had suppressed for decades. How she had secretly mapped the area of her encounter and avoided it during subsequent forest explorations. How she had studied indigenous legends about forest beings after leaving for college. How she had occasionally spotted unusual track patterns during family hiking trips, but had deliberately steered us away without explanation. When I asked why she had maintained her silence for so long, her answer was revealing. Once you've seen something that most people insist cannot exist, you face an impossible choice. Either you question your own perception, your own sanity, or you accept that the world is fundamentally different from what you've been taught. Neither option offers comfort. My hiking trip to the Appalachians proceeded as planned that May, though with a heightened awareness shaped by my mother's revelation. I found myself attuned to the forest in ways I hadn't been before, noting subtle shifts in wildlife sounds, watching the tree line with greater attention, feeling a distinct unease when our group approached creek crossings in late afternoon. We encountered nothing unusual, just the expected beauty of ancient mountains in spring, with wildflowers carpeting the forest floor and new leaves creating a vibrant green canopy overhead. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that I was being permitted to witness only the surface of something much deeper and more complex. Upon my return, I began researching historical accounts of similar encounters in the Appalachian region. The literature was extensive but uneven. Credible first-hand accounts mixed with obvious hoaxes, scientific analysis alongside sensationalist speculation. Indigenous traditions from Cherokee and other Appalachian tribes described various forest beings with characteristics similar to what my mother had described, though filtered through cultural and spiritual frameworks that differed from modern cryptozoological approaches. I found myself drawn particularly to the anthropological perspectives, the notion that legends of wild men and forest beings might represent cultural memories of real but rare encounters with relict hominid populations or unusual natural phenomena. These scholarly approaches offered a middle ground between total dismissal and uncritical acceptance. When I shared some of these findings with my mother, she listened with interest, but without the need for validation that might have characterized someone less certain of their experience. "I don't need proof," she said simply. "I know what I saw." Her certainty gave me pause. Throughout my life, I had known my mother as rational, practical, and skeptical of extraordinary claims. She approached the world with scientific curiosity rather than superstition. This made her unwavering conviction all the more compelling. In the years since her revelation, our relationship has deepened around this shared secret. We've had countless conversations exploring the implications of her encounter, not just the question of what exactly she saw that day, but the more profound issue of how we integrate experiences that challenge our fundamental understanding of reality. Now, as I write this account, I find myself grappling with the same questions that haunted my mother for decades. What exists in the remote corners of our world, in the deepest shadows of ancient forests? How do we reconcile unexplainable experiences with our need for a coherent, rational worldview? What is lost when we dismiss accounts like my mother's as mere imagination or misidentification? I have no definitive answers. The forest keeps its secrets, revealing them only in rare, fleeting moments to those who happen to be in the right place at precisely the right, or perhaps wrong, time. What remains certain is the profound impact of that July afternoon on my mother's life, and by extension on mine. A single encounter beside a mountain creek altered the course of her development, influenced her choices of where and how to live, affected her parenting philosophy, and created within her a division between public knowledge and private truth that she maintained for 4 decades. Sometimes wonder how different her life might have been without that encounter, whether she would have remained more deeply connected to the mountains she loved, whether she would have pursued different academic or career paths, whether she would have raised me and my brother with more freedom to explore unsupervised. But such counterfactuals offer little insight. What matters is the reality she experienced and how she chose to respond to it, with caution but not paralysis, with respect for the unknown but not fear, with silence but not denial. As my mother settles into her retirement community, surrounded by carefully landscaped grounds where nature is tamed and predictable, I notice how she still positions her chair to face the window, how her eyes still scan the tree line at dusk, how she still grows quiet when thunderstorms approach. Some experiences leave permanent imprints. Some memories never fade, and some encounters, however brief, reveal glimpses of a world more vast and mysterious than we typically acknowledge. The forest my mother knew as a child continues to change. Development encroaches further each year, fragmenting wildlife habitats and reducing truly remote areas. Perhaps the creature she encountered has retreated deeper into the remaining wilderness. Perhaps it was already rare in 1979 and has since vanished entirely. Or perhaps it still moves silently through the ancient hollows and ridges, occasionally crossing paths with humans who, like my mother, find their understanding of the world irrevocably altered. I don't know if I'll ever have my own encounter. Part of me hopes I will, that I might experience firsthand what my mother described. Another part hopes I won't, that I'll be spared the burden of knowledge that cannot be comfortably shared. What I do know is that I'll return to those mountains, walking the trails with open eyes and an open mind, listening for the sudden silence that might herald something extraordinary. And whether I encounter anything unusual or not, I'll remember my mother's story, not as folklore or family legend, but as lived experience passed from one generation to the next, an inheritance more valuable than any material possession. Some would call this story a tall tale, a product of imagination or misperception. Perhaps they're right, but I prefer to believe that the world still holds mysteries beyond our current understanding, that the maps of our knowledge still contain regions marked "Here be dragons," awaiting further exploration. After all, the truest thing my mother ever taught me was this: the most important discoveries often happen not when we find what we're looking for, but when we encounter something we never expected to find. I began working at the Evergreen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in October 2020, just as the autumn leaves painted the surrounding forest in brilliant hues of orange and red. Located atop Hemlock Hill, the center sits nestled among dense woods, approximately 20 minutes from even the nearest streetlight. During daylight hours, the property exudes tranquility, sunlight filtering through ancient trees, the sounds of birds calling, and the occasional rustling of recovering wildlife in their enclosures. But as darkness falls, the center transforms. The forest seems to swallow all light, creating a darkness so complete you can barely see your hand before your face unless the moon manages to rise high enough above the tree line. For privacy and protection of the animals in our care, I won't disclose our exact location beyond saying we're in the northwestern United States. My supervisor, Imogen, hired me as a rehabilitation specialist, primarily working the closing shift from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. In reality, those hours were merely suggestions. The sheer volume of injured and orphaned wildlife meant we often remained until midnight or later, ensuring every creature received proper care before we departed. "You'll get used to the late nights," Imogen told me during my first week. Her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun as she demonstrated how to tube feed an orphaned fawn. "Just remember, after dark, stay alert. This place changes." I assumed she was warning me about practical concerns, the difficulty navigating the grounds without adequate lighting, possible encounters with wild predators, or the challenges of animal care in limited visibility. I considered myself practical and scientifically minded. My background in zoology and veterinary assistance had taught me to seek logical explanations before jumping to conclusions. That mindset would be repeatedly tested in the months ahead. My first month passed uneventfully. I found immense satisfaction in nursing injured hawks back to health, bottle-feeding orphaned raccoon kits, and witnessing the gradual recovery of creatures that would otherwise have perished. My colleagues, Imogen Bernard, our veterinarian, Ruby, our facilities manager, and two interns named Josephine and Marcus, formed a tight-knit team, united by our passion for wildlife conservation. The center itself was a converted farmhouse with modern additions. The main building housed our medical facilities, indoor rehabilitation enclosures, staff offices, and a small kitchen break area. Outside, larger enclosures and flight cages dotted the 5-acre property, along with a separate small building that once served as housing for overnight interns, but now functioned primarily as storage. It wasn't until my 6th week that I experienced something I couldn't easily explain. I was completing final medications in our intensive care room around 10:30 p.m. Everyone else had departed, except for Bernard, who was finishing paperwork in his office down the hall. The only sounds were the soft whir of oxygen concentrators and the occasional rustle from the recovery cages. As I measured medication for a barred owl with a wing injury, the distinct sound of footsteps crossed the ceiling above me, slow, deliberate steps that creaked the old floorboards in a rhythmic pattern. I paused, syringe in hand, and looked up. "Bernard," I called out, assuming he had gone upstairs to retrieve something. No response came, but the footsteps continued their measured pace. I set down the medication and stepped into the hallway. "Bernard, are you upstairs?" His voice answered from his office down the corridor. "No, still working on these intake forms. Why?" The footsteps overhead stopped abruptly. "Nothing," I replied, a peculiar unease settling in my stomach. "Just thought I heard something." Later, as we locked up for the night, I casually mentioned the footsteps to Bernard. "Ah," he nodded knowingly, his expression unreadable in the dim parking lot light. "The upstairs walker. You'll get used to it." "The upstairs walker," I repeated. Bernard shrugged, his keys jingling in his hand. "This place has history. More than most know. You'll learn eventually. Everyone who stays here long enough does." He climbed into his truck before I could press further. "See you tomorrow. Don't think about it too much." But I did think about it extensively. I told myself the sounds were likely caused by the building settling, perhaps exacerbated by temperature changes as night fell. Old farmhouses make noise. This was a fact I understood. What I didn't understand was why those measured footsteps would become so familiar in the months ahead, or why they always seemed to pace most actively when I worked alone. By December, the daylight hours had shortened dramatically. I arrived for my shifts in pale morning light and departed in absolute darkness. The winter brought both challenges and benefits to our work. Fewer injured animals arrived daily, but those in our care required more attention to maintain body temperature and fight seasonal illnesses. During this period, I began to notice subtle changes in the center's atmosphere after sunset. Rooms that felt welcoming and functional during daylight developed cold spots after dark. The medical supply closet, in particular, would drop in temperature so dramatically that breath would fog regardless of the building's heating system. My colleague Ruby, who had worked at the center for over 15 years, seemed completely unsurprised by these phenomena. One evening, as we prepared diets for the next day's feedings, I mentioned the temperature fluctuations. "Some spaces in this building never warm properly," she said matter-of-factly. "Chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency, especially after 8:30. "What's significant about 8:30? I asked. Ruby's knife paused momentarily. "Nothing official. Just seems to be when things shift," she resumed chopping. "You've noticed it too, haven't you? How the energy changes?" I had indeed noticed, though I'd been reluctant to acknowledge it. After 8:30 p.m., the building seemed to develop a watchfulness, an awareness that made the hair on my arms stand on end when I walked certain hallways alone. I thought it was just me. I admitted, "It's not." Ruby scraped vegetables into a container. "Imogen calls it the evening turn. Bernard says it's just our minds playing tricks after a long day. Whatever you want to call it, it's been happening since before I started here." That night, I paid specific attention to the clock as I worked late. At precisely 8:27 p.m., I stood in the main corridor, clipboard in hand, waiting. 3 minutes passed with nothing but the normal sounds of the building's heating system and distant animal noises. Then, at 8:30, something changed. The quality of silence shifted. The ambient sounds didn't disappear. They simply seemed farther away, as though a buffer had formed around me. The air pressure subtly altered, creating the sensation you experience just before a thunderstorm breaks. Most notably, I became acutely aware of the empty spaces behind me, constantly fighting the urge to turn and check them. I forced myself to continue my rounds, visiting each recovery room and outdoor enclosure. Everything appeared normal, yet nothing felt normal. Each shadow seemed deeper, each unoccupied room more vacant than empty, as though the absence itself had substance. In the outdoor flight cage, as I checked on a recovering great horned owl, I distinctly heard someone whisper my name from the darkness beyond the fence line. The sound came from the direction of the old storage building, a soft, insistent call that made my skin crawl. I directed my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing moved in the beam except wind-blown branches. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the owl's agitated shuffling on its perch. When I returned inside, I found Josephine, one of our interns, looking pale in the break room. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting down my clipboard. She hesitated, twisting her hands together. I was organizing the medication refrigerator and heard someone humming in the treatment room. I thought it was you, but when I looked in, no one was there. The humming stopped when I opened the door. "What tune was it?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Josephine's eyes widened slightly. "I don't know exactly. Something old-sounding, like a folk song maybe. It wasn't unpleasant, just unexpected." She laughed nervously. "I'm probably just tired." I nodded, offering the explanation we all clung to. "Long days here can mess with your perception. I've had similar experiences." What I didn't tell her was how common these occurrences had become, or how they intensified with each passing week. I didn't mention the footsteps that followed me down empty hallways, only to cease when I turned around. The shadows that moved independently of any light source, or the increasing frequency with which I found doors I'd closed standing open when I returned. Instead, I finished my shift, drove home through the pitch-black forest roads, and tried to convince myself that fatigue and isolation were playing havoc with my senses. I almost believed it, until the incident with the doorbell changed everything. January brought heavy snowfall that transformed our hilltop sanctuary into an isolated island of white. The plowed road leading to the center became a narrow corridor between towering snowbanks, and on multiple occasions, staff simply couldn't make it in. Those of us who lived closer took on additional shifts, sometimes staying overnight when storms made travel impossible. During one such snowbound evening, with only myself, Bernard, and Ruby present, Bernard decided it was an appropriate time to share the center's history. "Since you've been experiencing things," he began, warming his hands around a mug of coffee, "you might as well understand why." We sat in the break room, the wind howling outside, the old farmhouse creaking under the weight of accumulated snow. "This property has witnessed considerable suffering," Bernard continued. "The original farmhouse, parts of which form the core of this building, was established in 1831 by settlers who claimed the land from local indigenous tribes. The conflict that ensued was significant." Ruby nodded solemnly. "The farmer who built this place was eventually killed during a dispute over land boundaries, but not before he'd participated in forcing local tribes from their ancestral territories. What Bernard is tactfully avoiding stating directly," she continued, "is that a segment of what became known as the Trail of Tears passed through this very property. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, died on this hillside during forced relocation. The Trail of Tears, the forced relocation of Native American nations, wasn't something I'd associated with our northwestern location. My historical understanding had placed those events primarily in the southeastern United States. There were several removal routes," Bernard explained, noting my confusion. "The experiences of Western tribes are less documented in popular history, but no less tragic. This particular path was used to relocate a smaller band that had already been displaced multiple times." The knowledge sat heavily in my chest. "So you believe the paranormal activities here are connected to this history?" "I don't claim to know," Bernard replied carefully. "I'm a veterinarian, not a historian or paranormal expert. What I do know is that indigenous oral histories describe this hill as a place where the boundary between worlds grows thin, even before European contact. The local tribes considered it simultaneously sacred and dangerous. Ruby added, after the Trail of Tears, the property changed hands frequently. No owner kept it longer than 5 years until the 1940s, when the Jensen family converted it to a hunting lodge. Even they reported strange occurrences. Voices in empty rooms, tools that disappeared and reappeared. Unexplained lights in the forest. The Wildlife Center has occupied the property since 1997, Bernard continued. In that time, every long-term employee has experienced something. Most of us simply accept it as part of working here. Has anyone been harmed? I asked, the practical question foremost in my mind. Never, Ruby answered firmly. Frightened, certainly. Unsettled, absolutely. But whatever presences occupy this space alongside us have never shown malevolence, merely awareness. As if responding to her words, the lights flickered briefly, and the ancient radiator in the corner ceased its rattling before resuming at a different pitch. Bernard smiled thinly. They're always more active during storms. Something about the energy, perhaps. That night, as heavy snow isolated us further from the outside world, I slept fitfully on the break room couch. My dreams were fragmented with images of people walking through snow-covered forests, their faces gaunt with suffering, their eyes fixed on a distant point I couldn't see. I woke repeatedly, each time convinced someone stood watching me from the darkened doorway, only to find it empty when my eyes adjusted. In the grey light of morning, as I helped Bernard clear snow from the outdoor enclosures, I asked the question that had troubled my dreams. The woman in buckskin that some staff have reported seeing, do you think she's from that period? The Trail of Tears? Bernard paused, leaning on his shovel. Imogen believes so. She's seen her most clearly, says she wears traditional clothing that would align with that era. Have you seen her? Once, he admitted, resuming his shoveling. In the laundry room about 3 years ago. She was standing by the utility sink, looking out the window toward the old intern housing. When I entered, she turned toward me for just a moment. He stopped again, his expression distant. Her eyes held such profound sorrow that I couldn't speak. Then she simply wasn't there anymore. What do you think she wants? I asked. Bernard considered this. I don't believe it's about wanting something. Some experiences are simply so powerful they imprint themselves on a place, like emotional echoes that replay under certain conditions. I wasn't entirely satisfied with this explanation, but it provided a framework for understanding, a middle ground between skeptical dismissal and supernatural fear. That afternoon, as the sky darkened with renewed snowfall, I found myself alone in the medical supply room, inventorying medications. The familiar cold spot had formed, so pronounced that I'd put on an extra sweater before entering. As I counted antibiotic vials, a soft sound reached my ears, the rhythmic pat-pat-pat of bare feet on the wooden floor behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see nothing as usual. Instead, water droplets formed a trail across the floor, small, perfect circles of moisture appearing one after another, as though left by invisible feet. The drops continued halfway across the room before stopping abruptly. I stood frozen, clipboard clutched against my chest as the water droplets slowly evaporated, disappearing in the same order they had appeared. The rational part of my mind immediately sought explanations. A leaking pipe above the ceiling, condensation dripping from something I couldn't see. Yet I knew with inexplicable certainty that I was witnessing footprints formed by someone who had walked this land during the terrible journey that had claimed so many lives. Later, I would tell Bernard and Ruby about the incident. They would exchange glances before Ruby said simply, "The water walker. We haven't seen those tracks in almost 2 years." February brought an unusual warm spell that melted much of the snow, turning the ground to mud and swelling the creek that ran along the property's eastern boundary. With the improved weather came an increase in wildlife admissions, early season babies fallen from nests, animals emerging from winter dormancy only to encounter human hazards. The increased workload meant more late nights for all of us, More instances of being alone in distant parts of the property after dark. Perhaps this is why the doorbell incidents began, the building responding to our extended presence, or whatever dwelled within it, growing more comfortable with our constant company. The first occurrence happened on a Tuesday evening. Most of the staff had departed, leaving only myself, Ruby, and Marcus to finish the final feeding rounds. I was in the basement organizing donated supplies when the distinct chime of our front doorbell echoed through the building. The sound was unmistakable, a two-tone electronic ring installed to replace the original mechanical bell decades earlier. Checking my watch, I noted it was nearly 10 p.m., far too late for scheduled drop-offs or visitors. Nevertheless, the Wildlife Center occasionally received emergency cases at unusual hours. Typically injured animals found by well-meaning citizens. Through the ceiling, I heard Ruby's footsteps cross the main floor toward the entrance. Minutes passed as I continued sorting supplies, expecting to hear voices or the sounds of an animal intake procedure. Instead, Ruby's footsteps returned, moving more quickly than before. When I came upstairs 15 minutes later, I found her in the treatment room, reorganizing supplies that didn't need reorganizing, a nervous habit I'd noticed she exhibited when unsettled. "Who was at the door?" I asked, Ruby's hand stilled. "No one. No one." But I heard the doorbell. "Yes, the doorbell rang," she confirmed, resuming her unnecessary sorting. But when I answered it, there was nobody there. No car in the parking lot, no footprints in the mud outside the door. Nothing. I considered this. Maybe kids playing pranks? Ring and run? "We're 20 minutes from the nearest house, up a private road in near total darkness," Ruby replied flatly. Not exactly prime territory for bored teenagers. The incident might have been dismissed as a doorbell malfunction if it hadn't repeated exactly 1 week later. This time, Marcus answered the door to find the same emptiness. The third occurrence, exactly 7 days after that, was answered by Imogen with identical results. "It's always at the same time," Bernard noted when we discussed the pattern. 9:47 p.m. every Tuesday." "That can't be coincidence," I said. "No," Imogen agreed. "And it's not electrical malfunction either. I had Ruby's husband check the wiring. Everything's sound." The following Tuesday, all remaining staff gathered in the front reception area at 9:40 p.m. 7 minutes later, precisely on schedule, the doorbell chimed its two-tone announcement. Bernard immediately opened the door. Nothing but darkness greeted us, the motion-activated porch light illuminating an empty concrete step and the muddy parking lot beyond. No vehicles approached on the long driveway visible from our elevated position. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered, stepping outside to examine the doorbell button itself. "Maybe there's water damage causing a short circuit." The button showed no sign of damage or moisture intrusion. As Marcus reached to press it experimentally, a loud, distinct knocking sounded, not from the door we'd just opened, but from the side entrance at the opposite end of the building. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced. We froze, exchanging startled glances. "That's not possible," Ruby whispered. "No one could have moved from here to there that quickly without us seeing them cross the parking lot." Bernard, ever practical, was already moving toward the side entrance, flashlight in hand. I followed close behind, unable to deny my curiosity, despite growing unease. The side entrance led directly to the area, housing our incubators and intensive care units. It remained locked at all times, except during supply deliveries, with only staff possessing keys. Bernard unlocked the door and pulled it open sharply. Again, emptiness greeted us. No person, no animal, no explanation for the knocking. As we stood puzzling over this development, the main door we'd left open slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. By the time we returned to the front, Marcus and Ruby were staring at the closed door with identical expressions of disbelief. "It wasn't the wind," Marcus stated before we could ask. "There's barely a breeze tonight." The door just closed like someone pulled it shut. From that night forward, the Tuesday doorbell ritual continued with mathematical precision. but with an added dimension after the doorbell rang. Knocking would sound from a different door somewhere in the building, followed by the definitive closure of the front entrance, regardless of how securely we propped it open. We began documenting these events in the daily log, noting patterns and variations. After the fifth occurrence, Imogen shared a theory that had been forming in her mind. "I believe someone is trying to recreate their arrival," she said quietly as we gathered in the break room. "Think about it. A doorbell symbolizes seeking entrance, asking permission to cross a threshold. The knocking represents increasing urgency when that initial request goes unanswered. The closing door," she paused. "Well, that could represent many things. Rejection, perhaps, or finality. You think it's someone who was turned away from this property?" I asked. "During its history as a farmhouse." Imogen shook her head slightly. "Not necessarily turned away. Perhaps someone who sought shelter here during their journey on the Trail of Tears, but died before receiving it. Or someone who arrived too late to say goodbye to a loved one who perished here." The theory wasn't provable, of course, but it carried an emotional resonance that none of us could easily dismiss. The precise timing suggested purpose rather than random haunting, as though someone was commemorating an anniversary only they remembered. As the weeks passed, I found myself developing a strange anticipation for Tuesday evenings. The doorbell visitations, while unsettling, carried no sense of malice, only a persistent, almost desperate attempt to communicate something we couldn't quite understand. During the sixth occurrence, I stationed myself near the front window rather than the door, watching the empty porch as the 9:47 deadline approached. When the doorbell chimed, I observed something the others missed in their focus on the door itself, a brief, localized disturbance in the air above the front step, like heat rising from hot pavement, forming the vague outline of a hunched human figure. The apparition, if that's what it was, lasted mere seconds before dissolving. I kept this observation to myself, uncertain whether it represented an actual sighting or merely my mind creating patterns from suggestion and expectation. The following Tuesday, however, Ruby reported seeing the same atmospheric disturbance, describing it in terms almost identical to my unshared experience. When Josephine independently confirmed the sighting during the next occurrence, we could no longer attribute it to imagination. Something or someone was arriving at our door every Tuesday night, seeking entrance that was perpetually denied, despite our open door. March arrived with strengthening sunlight and the busy season of spring rehabilitation. Baby squirrels, raccoons, and early bird hatchlings filled our nursery rooms with constant feeding demands. The intensity of work pushed the paranormal aspects of the center temporarily into the background, until the incident with the storage building forced them back to our attention. The small outbuilding that had originally served as intern housing sat approximately 50 yards from the main center, positioned at the edge of the forest line. A simple structure with 2 rooms, a bathroom, and a kitchenette. It had been converted to storage after the center expanded the main building to include proper staff facilities. I'd always felt an aversion to the storage building, experiencing inexplicable anxiety whenever I needed to retrieve supplies stored there. Other staff members had expressed similar discomfort, particularly about entering it after sunset. Imogen explained this reluctance during an afternoon inventory session. "That building has always had a different energy than the main center," she said, as we sorted through donated towels. When it still housed interns, at least one person every season would request relocation to the main building, usually after reporting unusual dreams or the sensation of being watched while they slept. "What kind of dreams?" I asked. "Consistently similar ones," Imogen replied. "Dreams of being lost in snow-covered woods, searching for something they couldn't name. Or dreams of standing at the window, watching shadowy figures move through the trees." I thought of Bernard's comment about the woman in buckskin staring toward the storage building. Did anything specific happen to cause the change from housing to storage? Imogen hesitated, folding a towel with precise motions. "Yes, though we don't typically share this with newer staff until they've been here longer." She glanced at me appraisingly. "You've experienced enough now that you should know." She sat on a nearby stool, her normally efficient movements slowing. "About 5 years ago, we had 2 interns sharing the building, college students named Weston and Beatrice. Bright kids dedicated to wildlife work. One night in October, they both woke to find a man standing in the doorway between their rooms, just watching them sleep. My skin prickled with gooseflesh. An intruder? That was our first assumption," Imogen nodded. "We called police, changed locks, installed motion lights. But certain details didn't align with a human intruder. The building had been locked from inside, with both deadbolt and chain. The motion lights never activated. Most significantly, both interns described the man identically, tall and gaunt, wearing clothing from at least a century ago, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. They both saw this," I confirmed. "From separate rooms, yes. Weston described the man as looking like he was searching for something but disappointed not to find it. Beatrice said he appeared confused, then resigned, as though confirming something he already knew. After this incident, Imogen explained, no intern would stay in the building overnight. Within months, it had been repurposed for storage, with security cameras installed around its perimeter. "Have the cameras ever captured anything unusual?" I asked. "Officially, no," Imogen replied carefully. "Though there have been instances of unexplained interference, static, signal loss, battery drainage, particularly on cold, clear nights." 2 days after this conversation, circumstances forced me to confront my unease about the storage building directly. A late delivery of specialized formula needed for our orphaned fawns had been incorrectly placed in the outbuilding's refrigerator rather than brought to the main kitchen. With everyone else occupied with evening feedings, I volunteered to retrieve it. The March evening was already dark as I crossed the muddy yard, flashlight illuminating the path. The storage building stood silhouetted against the slightly lighter backdrop of night sky, its windows dark except for the security light that automatically illuminated the entrance. Using my key, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately struck by the dramatic temperature drop compared to the outside air. My breath fogged visibly despite the mild evening. The building smelled of dust and disuse, with undertones of something less definable, something old and vaguely medicinal. I moved quickly to the kitchenette, located the formula in the refrigerator, and turned to leave, only to freeze in place as a floorboard creaked distinctly in the room behind me. The sound was unmistakable, the compression of old wood under weight, followed by the slight release groan that comes when pressure lifts. Someone or something had taken a step in the adjacent room. Rational explanations flooded my mind, temperature changes causing the wood to expand or contract, a small animal that had found its way inside, the natural settling of an old structure. Yet none of these adequately explained the deliberate, measured quality of the sound, a human footstep, not a random structural noise. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the cold air. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the temperature seemed to drop further, creating a painful tightness in my lungs. I had 2 choices: investigate the adjoining room or leave immediately. Self-preservation warred with curiosity, the latter ultimately prevailing. Clutching the formula container in one hand and my flashlight in the other, I moved slowly toward the doorway, separating the kitchenette from the main room. The beam of my flashlight cut through darkness, illuminating dust motes that swirled in distinct patterns, not the random drift caused by my movement, but circular formations that suggested someone unseen had just passed through them. The main room appeared empty of any human presence, filled only with storage shelves and boxes of supplies. Yet as my light swept across the space, it briefly caught a distortion in the air near the far window, the same heat mirage effect we'd observed during the doorbell incidents. The distortion moved, shifting toward the window as though drawn by the night beyond. As it reached the glass, the window abruptly fogged from the inside, moisture condensing as if someone had exhaled against it. A finger, invisible but undeniably present, traced a pattern in the condensation. 3 simple lines forming what appeared to be an arrow pointing east toward the densest part of the forest. I remained rooted in place, unable to retreat, yet unwilling to advance further into the room. The formula container in my hand had grown so cold it burned against my skin. Yet I couldn't bring myself to release it, just as suddenly as it had formed. The condensation began to evaporate, the drawn arrow disappearing last. The air temperature gradually normalized, warming enough that my breath no longer fogged. Whatever presence had occupied the room seemed to have departed, drawn away by something in the forest beyond the window. Only then did I notice that the security light outside had extinguished, plunging the yard between buildings into absolute darkness. I made my way back to the main center at a pace just short of running, the formula clutched against my chest. When I reached the brightly lit kitchen, Ruby took one look at my face and wordlessly poured a cup of tea, adding a generous splash from a bottle kept in the upper cabinet. "The storage building?" she asked simply. I nodded, accepting the tea with gratitude. "You saw something?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Not saw exactly, experienced." Ruby nodded as though this made perfect sense. "It's always stronger when you're alone there. Something about solitary visitors seems to facilitate interaction." Later that night, after sharing my experience with the others, Bernard revealed something he'd withheld previously. The building served another purpose before becoming intern housing, he said quietly. During the Trail of Tears passage, it functioned as what they euphemistically called a rest station, essentially a place where those too ill to continue the journey were left to either recover or die. The implications settled heavily among us. The arrow pointing eastward suddenly carried potential meaning, perhaps indicating the direction the journey had continued, or the path those who recovered were meant to follow to rejoin their people. "The man in old-fashioned clothing that the intern saw," I began. "Possibly a caretaker assigned to the station," Bernard finished. "Or perhaps someone who died there, still performing his assigned duty of watching over the ill." After that night, we implemented an unofficial policy that no one would enter the storage building alone after dark. Camera monitoring increased. Though no unusual images were ever captured, only occasional inexplicable malfunctions that coincided with reported feelings of being watched while crossing the yard. I never saw the arrow drawn again, though others occasionally reported window condensation forming without apparent cause. Whatever presence occupied the old rest station seemed content with the acknowledgement of its existence, rarely manifesting in ways more dramatic than cold spots and the persistent sense of being observed. April brought rain that transformed the forest around the center into a riot of new growth. Mud gradually gave way to emerging grasses, and the increased daylight hours lightened the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the winter months. The paranormal activities didn't cease, but they shifted in nature, becoming less overt, more integrated into the background rhythm of the center. I had grown accustomed to certain phenomena: the footsteps upstairs when no one was present, cold spots that formed and dissolved without correlation to the heating system, the occasional glimpse of movement where no movement should be. These experiences had become almost routine, meriting mention in the daily log, but no longer provoking the anxiety they once had. However, a new manifestation began during this period, one more intimate and directed than the generalized hauntings we'd experienced previously. It began with whispers. The first instance occurred while I was feeding an orphaned fox kit in the nursery room. Alone with the tiny creature, focused entirely on ensuring it accepted the specialized formula, I distinctly heard someone whisper directly behind me, "Be careful with that one. She bites. The voice was female, soft but clearly audible, carrying a subtle accent I couldn't place. I turned instinctively, finding the room empty as expected. When I returned my attention to the kit, I noticed for the first time the way it positioned its head during feeding, angled slightly, as though preparing to nip at the syringe if given opportunity. Taking the whispered advice, I adjusted my handling technique. The kit fed peacefully afterward, making no attempt to bite. I might have dismissed the incident as imagination if similar whispers hadn't begun to occur regularly. Always when I worked alone, always offering brief but practical information about the animals in our care. The raccoon in corner cage hides food in his bedding. The swan's wing needs stretching. She won't do it herself. Watch the bobcat's left eye. Infection returning. Each whispered observation proved accurate. The raccoon had indeed been concealing food portions, risking spoilage and disease. The swan's healing wing showed signs of stiffening that responded well to the suggested passive stretching. The bobcat, despite appearing to recover from a previous eye infection, showed subtle symptoms of recurrence that might have been missed without the directed attention. I began to wonder if I'd developed an auditory hallucination driven by subconscious observations, my mind creating a voice to communicate what my eyes had already registered but not consciously processed. This rationalization felt thin, particularly when the whispers began providing information I couldn't possibly have known. Check behind the supply cabinet. Medicine fell there last week, sure enough. A critical antibiotic vial had rolled into that inaccessible space, missing from inventory and presumed depleted. The hawk won't eat because of the mouse nest in the wall. Too much movement. Investigation revealed exactly that. A mouse family had established residence inside the wall, adjacent to a recovering red-tailed hawk's enclosure, their activity apparently distressing the sensitive raptor. I finally shared these experiences with Bernard during a quiet evening shift. His response surprised me. "You're hearing Josephine?" he said simply, continuing to organize medical records as though he'd made a perfectly ordinary statement. "Josephine? Our intern?" But she wasn't present during any of these incidents. Bernard looked up, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "Not our Josephine. The original Josephine, the one this center is partly named after. This was entirely new information. I'd assumed Evergreen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center simply referenced the surrounding forest. The full name is the Evergreen Josephine Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Bernard explained, though we rarely use the complete version except on official documents. Josephine Blackriver was a local indigenous woman who worked with the property's owners in the 1950s, developing early wildlife rehabilitation techniques before the practice was formalized. She was apparently remarkably gifted with animals, he continued, particularly in diagnosing ailments through observation alone. She worked here until her death in 1963, a heart attack, while treating an injured eagle. "And you think I'm hearing her voice?" I clarified, struggling to keep skepticism from my tone. "I think you're receiving the same guidance she's offered to receptive staff members for decades," Bernard replied matter-of-factly. "Imogen heard her regularly when she first started. Ruby occasionally mentions receiving suggestions while working alone. I've experienced it myself, though less frequently in recent years." "Why haven't you mentioned this before?" Bernard closed the file cabinet deliberately before answering. "We don't typically discuss Josephine with new staff. Those who are receptive to her eventually hear her on their own. Those who aren't never need to know. But why me? Why now? Josephine seems to connect most strongly with those who share her dedication to the animals themselves, rather than to the science or career aspects of rehabilitation," Bernard theorized. "You've demonstrated exceptional observational skills and intuitive understanding of our patients' needs. Perhaps she recognizes a kindred approach." While this explanation ventured firmly into supernatural territory that my scientific background resisted, I couldn't deny the practical value of the whispered guidance. Whatever its source, the voice provided insights that improved animal care, my primary concern regardless of origin. The whispers continued through April and into May, becoming a quietly accepted aspect of my work at the center. Simultaneously, a secondary phenomenon emerged that seemed connected yet distinct, the constant sense of being watched during outdoor work. This sensation differed from the generalized unease the property sometimes generated. It carried a focused quality, as though specific eyes tracked my movements, particularly when I worked in the raptor flight cages or the farthest mammal enclosures near the forest edge. Other staff reported similar experiences, consistently describing the feeling as evaluation rather than threat, as though our work with the animals was being assessed by unseen observers. During a particularly intense session, conditioning a rehabilitated peregrine falcon for release, the sensation of observation grew so pronounced that I finally acknowledged it directly, speaking aloud to the apparently empty forest beyond the enclosure. "If you're watching, I could use suggestions. She's not responding to the lure as she should." The response wasn't audible, like Josephine's whispers. Instead, a sudden wind gust swept through the nearby trees, shaking branches and sending leaves spiraling to the ground. Within this natural disturbance, the falcon's attention fixed sharply on the lure for the first time, her hunter's instincts activated by the movement created in the artificial prey. Taking advantage of this engagement, I continued the training session with dramatically improved results. As I concluded the exercise, a sense of approval seemed to emanate from the forest, not communicated in words or even emotions, but through a subtle warming of the air that contrasted with the usual chill such proximity to the woods generated. Later that evening, sitting with Ruby on the center's back porch during a brief break, I described the interaction. "The watchers," she nodded, sipping from her thermos. "They're most active at the property boundaries, especially near the old game trails." "Who are they?" I asked, the question feeling simultaneously ridiculous and completely natural after months at the center. Ruby shrugged. "Bernard believes they're connected to the land's original purpose, that this hillside was once used for teaching young tribal members about animal behavior and hunting techniques. The watchers might be echoes of those teachers, still observing how humans interact with wildlife." "And what do you believe?" I pressed, sensing her hesitation. "I believe intention creates connection," she said after a thoughtful pause. "The indigenous people who first lived here, the forced migrants who suffered here, the wildlife rehabilitators who've worked here, all sharing fundamental intentions regarding respect for life and the balance between humans and animals, despite vastly different circumstances. That creates powerful resonance across time." As the conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, I contemplated how dramatically my perspective had shifted since beginning work at the center. The rational skepticism that had characterized my early responses to unexplained phenomena had given way to a more nuanced acceptance, not of every supernatural explanation offered, but of the possibility that human understanding remained limited in the face of certain experiences. Perhaps most significantly, I'd come to view the center's paranormal aspects not as fearsome hauntings, but as layers of accumulated presence, the emotional residue of countless lives, human and animal, that had intersected with this unique property throughout its complex history. By late May, I had developed a peculiar relationship with the center's supernatural elements. The whispers, the watching presences, the periodic manifestations, all had become integrated aspects of my work environment, neither feared nor dismissed, but acknowledged as part of the property's character. This equilibrium shattered during the season's first major thunderstorm. The event began unremarkably enough. A forecast of severe weather prompted additional preparations for animal comfort and safety. Lightning and thunder often distressed recovering wildlife, particularly those unaccustomed to human enclosures during such natural phenomena. By early evening, dark clouds had coalesced above the hillside, bringing premature darkness and a charged atmosphere that set both humans and animals on edge. I worked with Imogen and Marcus to secure outdoor enclosures, while Bernard and Ruby prepared the indoor spaces for potential power outages. The storm broke with dramatic intensity just after 8:30 p.m., that transitional time when the center's energy routinely shifted. Wind lashed rain against windows, while lightning transformed the landscape into strobing tableaus of tree silhouettes and glistening wet surfaces. Thunder followed with physical force that vibrated through the old farmhouse structure. As we completed the final preparations, the power flickered once, twice, then failed completely, plunging the building into darkness, broken only by emergency lighting in critical animal care areas. The backup generator activated automatically, providing essential support for incubators and oxygen concentrators, but leaving most of the center illuminated only by flashlights and battery lanterns. It was in this environment of reduced visibility, heightened sensory awareness, and natural disruption that the center's paranormal aspects seemed to intensify exponentially. The first indication came from the animals themselves. Throughout the various recovery rooms and enclosures, patients that should have been agitated by the storm instead displayed unusual calm. Birds settled quietly on perches, mammals curled in sleeping positions. Reptiles remained basking as though the environmental disruption simply didn't register. "They're never this settled during storms," Ruby observed, checking temperatures in the nursery. "Even with our storm protocols." Imogen nodded agreement. "It's like they're being reassured somehow." As if in response to this observation, a distinct humming began, not electrical in nature, but musical. The sound originated from multiple locations simultaneously, a simple melodic pattern that rose and fell in harmony with the storm's intensity. I recognized it immediately as the tune Josephine had mentioned, hearing in the medication room months earlier. "The humming," I said quietly. "You all hear it too?" The others nodded, expressions varying from wonder to unease. "It's a traditional calming song," Imogen explained. "Used to soothe children during frightening situations. I've heard it before during particularly severe weather." The humming continued, providing an incongruously peaceful counterpoint to the violent storm. As we moved through our emergency protocols, checking each animal and securing loose items, other phenomena manifested with unprecedented clarity. The footsteps upstairs, typically limited to isolated corridors, now sounded throughout the building. Dozens of distinct gates, moving with purpose, some heavy and measured, others light and quick. Doors opened and closed without human intervention, not violently but with deliberate control, as though unseen individuals were methodically checking each room. Most dramatically, the condensation effect we'd witnessed during the doorbell incidents and in the storage building now appeared on every window, moisture forming not randomly but in distinctive patterns that suggested human breath. On several panes, finger-drawn marks appeared, creating symbols I didn't recognize, but that Imogen identified as protective sigils from local indigenous traditions. "They're helping us secure the building," she said with quiet certainty, reinforcing our preparations. The practical implications of this statement, that unseen entities were actively collaborating with our emergency response, might have seemed absurd under normal circumstances. In that moment, surrounded by evidence of coordinated paranormal activity aligned with our own efforts, it felt entirely plausible. The convergence of phenomena reached its peak when the front doorbell rang, not its usual Tuesday evening chime, but an urgent, repeated signal that cut through the storm noise. Bernard and I exchanged glances before moving toward the entrance together, flashlights illuminating our path through the darkened reception area. The doorbell continued its insistent summons as Bernard unlocked and opened the door, revealing a rain-lashed darkness broken by lightning flashes. Initially, The doorstep appeared empty as usual, until a particularly bright lightning burst illuminated a figure standing motionless in the downpour. For a brief, electric moment, I could see her clearly, a Native American woman in traditional buckskin clothing, her hair plastered to her face by rain, her expression urgent rather than sorrowful, as Bernard had previously described. She raised her hand in a beckoning gesture, pointing emphatically toward the storage building before the lightning faded, plunging her back into shadow. "You saw her too?" I asked Bernard, whose rigid posture confirmed the shared experience. "Yes," he replied tensely, "and she wants us to follow." Practical considerations warred with the unprecedented nature of the situation. The storm made outdoor movement dangerous, with lightning strikes and falling branches, creating genuine hazards. Yet the apparition's urgency suggested something equally dangerous might be occurring at the storage building. "Get raincoats and the heavy flashlights," Bernard instructed, his voice assuming the authoritative tone he typically reserved for medical emergencies. "I'll tell the others." Within minutes, Bernard, Imogen, and I were battling through wind-driven rain toward the storage building, the beam of our strongest flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. The security light that normally illuminated the outbuilding's entrance remained dark, either from power failure or something more deliberate. As we approached, another lightning flash revealed the buckskin-clad woman standing beside the building, her hand now pressed against its wall, in a gesture that suggested both warning and direction. When darkness returned, a soft blue luminescence remained where her hand had touched, a glowing handprint that pulsed gently, providing supernatural guidance through the storm. Bernard reached the door first, finding it unlocked, despite our protocols requiring it remain secured during severe weather. As he pushed it open, the beam of his flashlight revealed why we had been summoned with such urgency. The storage building's roof had partially collapsed under the force of the storm, allowing rain to pour through onto the sensitive medical equipment and supplies stored below. More critically, the falling debris had breached the wall of the refrigeration unit, containing temperature-sensitive medications and formula, irreplaceable items essential for the animals in our care. "We need to salvage what we can," Bernard shouted over the storm noise. "Focus on the refrigerated medications first, then the formula components." We worked feverishly in the beam of flashlights, removing critical supplies from the damaged area while battling continuing water intrusion. Without the apparition's intervention, we would have discovered the damage only after it became catastrophic, likely resulting in the loss of medications that could mean life or death for our most vulnerable patients. Throughout our salvage efforts, the glowing handprint remained visible on the exterior wall, joined gradually by other luminous marks that formed a protective boundary around the areas where we worked. The collapses continued elsewhere in the structure, yet no further debris fell near our position despite the building's progressive failure. When we had secured the most critical items, Bernard made the decision to abandon the remaining supplies. The structure's becoming unstable. We've saved what matters most. As we exited with our salvaged materials, a final lightning flash illuminated not just the buckskin-clad woman, but numerous figures standing at the forest edge, indistinct forms of varying heights and builds, watching our retreat with what felt like collective approval. Back in the main building, drenched but successful, we shared our experience with Ruby and Marcus, who had maintained animal care during our absence. Their own accounts of the interim period included unusual assistance, cabinet doors that opened automatically when needed, emergency supplies that seemed to migrate to accessible locations despite no one moving them, and most remarkably, animals that remained supernaturally calm despite the chaos of the storm. It's as though every presence associated with this property mobilized to help protect the animals, Ruby observed as we dried off in the break room. Emergency lanterns casting dramatic shadows, not just the animals, Imogen added. Us as well. The continued roof collapses should have injured or killed anyone in that building. Something kept the damage contained away from where we were working. As the night progressed and the storm gradually diminished, the paranormal activities subsided in parallel, the humming fading to occasional notes, the footsteps reducing to isolated occurrences, the condensation patterns evaporating from windows. By dawn, as power was restored and normal operations resumed, the center had returned to its usual level of supernatural presence, noticeable but not overwhelming. The storage building, however, had suffered irreparable damage. Nearly half its roof had collapsed, and structural assessments in the following days confirmed what we already suspected. The building could not be safely repaired. It would need to be demolished and potentially replaced with a modern structure. As workers arrived to begin the demolition process a week later, an unexpected discovery was made beneath the damaged flooring, a small cache of personal items, clearly dating to the Trail of Tears period, including handmade moccasins, a carved wooden medallion, and most significantly, a leather-wrapped packet of medicinal herbs still preserved in their protective covering. Archaeologists summoned to examine the find confirmed their historical significance and arranged for proper documentation before the items were returned to representatives of the indigenous nation most closely connected to those who had traveled the trail. The medicine packet in particular was identified as belonging to a tribal healer, someone who would have worked to save lives at the rest station during that terrible journey. In the weeks that followed, as plans developed for a replacement storage facility, the paranormal aspects of the property seemed to achieve a new equilibrium. The doorbell incidents ceased entirely, as though whatever had sought entrance had finally been acknowledged through our interactions during the storm. The footsteps upstairs continued, but with less frequency and intensity. Josephine's whispered. Guidance remained, focused primarily on animal care rather than building concerns. Most notably, the woman in buckskin was seen more frequently, but with a transformed demeanor, her expression no longer carrying the profound sorrow Bernard had initially described, but rather a watchful serenity that suggested some measure of resolution. Summer arrived with lengthening days and a flourishing rehabilitation program. The center reached its yearly peak of activity, dozens of orphaned fawns requiring bottle feeding, countless baby birds needing hourly nutrition, injured adults recovering in outdoor enclosures. With the increased demands came additional seasonal staff and volunteers, most unaware of the property's paranormal aspects. I had completed my first full year at Evergreen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, transitioning from skeptical newcomer to what Bernard called a hillside guardian, staff members who understood and acknowledged the property's unique convergence of natural and supernatural elements. The replacement for the damaged storage building had been completed in June, a modern structure incorporating sustainable materials and improved functionality. Unlike its predecessor, the new building generated no sense of unease or foreboding. Staff entered and exited freely at all hours, experiencing nothing more unusual than the occasional misplaced item that would later reappear in logical locations. It lacks history, Bernard explained when I commented on this difference. The original building carried decades of accumulated experience, some traumatic, some healing. This new space hasn't developed its own presence yet. Do you think it will? I asked. Eventually, he nodded. All places where significant work occurs develop character over time, but I doubt it will ever carry the weight of its predecessor. July brought the center's annual tradition, a small, private ceremony commemorating both its founding and the complex history of the land it occupied. Attended only by long-term staff and invited representatives from local indigenous communities. The event represented my formal introduction to the complete narrative of the property's past and purpose. As twilight settled over the hillside, we gathered in a clearing behind the main building. A small fire burned in a stone-ringed pit, its light casting warm illumination on the circle of chairs surrounding it. Imogen, as the center's director, opened the proceedings. "We gather tonight to acknowledge all who have walked this land before us," she began, her normally practical demeanor softened by firelight. "From the first peoples who recognized this hillside as a place of teaching and healing, to those who suffered here during forced relocation, to the conservationists who established this center to continue the work of balancing human impact with natural preservation." An elder from the local indigenous nation spoke next, offering words in his native language before transitioning to English. "This place has always existed between worlds," he said, his weathered face solemn in the flickering light. "Our ancestors recognized it as a thin place, where the boundary between physical and spiritual realms permits greater exchange. They came here to learn from both the visible animals and the invisible teachers who guide them." Bernard added historical context, detailing the property's transition from sacred ground to settlement land, from forced migration route to hunting lodge, and finally to wildlife rehabilitation center. He emphasized the consistent thread through these transformations, the land's connection to interactions between humans and animals, sometimes exploitative, but increasingly focused on stewardship and healing. When my turn came to speak, I shared my journey from skepticism to acceptance, from fear to understanding. I described how the center's paranormal aspects had revealed themselves gradually, challenging my scientific worldview without completely overturning it. I've come to view the unexplained phenomena not as violations of natural law, but as expressions of natural processes we don't yet comprehend, I concluded. The footsteps, the whispers, the apparitions, they represent persistence of purpose rather than disruption of reality. As darkness deepened and the fire burned lower, Ruby led us in placing small offerings near the forest edge. Birdseed, fruit, and handcrafted items that acknowledged both the wildlife we served and the presences that assisted our work. The practice combined elements of indigenous tradition with practical conservation ethics, symbolizing the center's integrated approach. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence broken only by natural forest sounds, owl calls, rustling leaves, distant water movement from the creek. Within this acoustic landscape, I detected what everyone around the fire clearly heard as well, the faint but distinct humming melody that had accompanied us during the thunderstorm, now offering a gentle conclusion to our gathering. In the months that followed, I developed a deeper appreciation for the center's dual nature, its function as a modern wildlife rehabilitation facility existing simultaneously with its role as a convergence point for energies and presences spanning centuries. This appreciation transformed my approach to daily work, enhancing rather than hindering my scientific practice. The paranormal aspects continued with seasonal variations, more active during winter storms and significant transitions, quieter during routine periods. New staff occasionally reported unexpected experiences, which long-term employees acknowledged without elaboration, allowing each person to develop their own relationship with the property's unique character. I remained particularly receptive to Josephine's whispered guidance, which proved consistently valuable in treating difficult cases. The woman in buckskin appeared periodically, primarily near the forest boundaries, her presence now interpreted as protective rather than sorrowful. The Tuesday doorbell remained silent, suggesting that whatever had sought acknowledgement had received sufficient recognition. As another autumn approached, marking my second year at the center, I found myself contemplating the nature of haunting itself. The traditional conception, tortured spirits bound to locations of trauma, seeking resolution or revenge, seemed inadequate to explain what we experienced on the hillside. The presences that shared our space demonstrated purpose rather than entrapment, collaboration rather than disruption. They responded to genuine need, manifesting most powerfully during crises when their assistance could make meaningful difference. They showed particular concern for the animals in our care, suggesting a shared mission that transcended temporal boundaries. Perhaps, I reasoned, what we called haunting might better be understood as continuity, the persistent influence of those whose deep connection to a particular place allowed aspects of their purpose to remain active long after their physical presence had ended. Not souls trapped between worlds, but intentional contributions continuing beyond conventional limitations. This perspective aligned with both indigenous wisdom about sacred places and emerging scientific understanding about energy conservation and transformation. It provided a framework that honored the experiences without requiring supernatural belief systems or abandoning rational inquiry. On a particularly clear September evening, as I completed final rounds in the outdoor enclosures, I paused at the forest boundary. The waning light painted the trees in gold and amber, creating an environment of extraordinary beauty. For a moment, I sensed, rather than saw, multiple presences among the deepening shadows, not threatening or even particularly mysterious, but simply present, engaged in the same work of stewardship and healing that occupied my own days. "Thank you," I said quietly to the watching forest, "for the guidance, the protection, the shared purpose." No dramatic response came, no apparition, no disembodied voice, no supernatural manifestation. Yet the quality of silence that answered seemed to carry acknowledgement, a mutual recognition between guardians, separated by time, but united by place and intention. As I turned back toward the brightly lit main building where my colleagues continued evening care routines, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this understanding. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center remained precisely what I had initially believed it to be, a scientific facility dedicated to animal conservation and welfare. The paranormal aspects hadn't changed that fundamental reality. They had merely revealed additional dimensions to the work, additional resources for fulfilling our mission. I entered my observations in the daily log, documenting both medical updates and subtle environmental factors that might influence animal recovery. Between standard notations about medication schedules and feeding responses, I added a simple observation: multiple presences active at forest edge during sunset. Calm, attentive energy, animals responding positively with reduced stress behaviors. In this integration of scientific observation with acknowledgement of the inexplicable, I had found my place among the guardians of the hillside, neither fully embracing supernatural explanation nor dismissing genuine experience, but working within the productive tension between known and unknown, visible and invisible, present and past. The Wildlife Center continued its essential work, healing injured creatures and returning them to their natural habitats. And in parallel, the hillside continued, its ancient function as a place where boundaries thinned and purposes aligned across time, a convergence point for all who dedicated themselves to preserving the delicate balance between human presence and natural world. Both activities, I'd come to understand, represented different expressions of the same fundamental intention: healing the broken, protecting the vulnerable, and maintaining the connections that sustain all life on the shared landscape we temporarily inhabit.